What are the best studying techniques? In this video, I'm going to do a tier list on some of those common techniques that people use for studying. If you're new to this channel and wondering who I am, I'm Dr. Justin Sung. I'm a learning coach and the head of learning at I Can Study. I'm also a former medical doctor. For the last decade, I've trained thousands of people to learn more efficiently. Unlike a normal tier list, I'm actually going to do this in two parts. In the first one, I'm going to just rank them as how people normally tend to use the technique. And then I'm going to then re-rank them based on how good they could be if they were either used the right way or with a few modifications that would make them a lot more effective. But first, the tier list based on the way I normally see people using these methods. And so the first item on this list is to give this video a like, because it really helps with the algorithm, which motivates me to make more free content. But anyway, starting with the real first one on the list is pre-study. So pre-study is a pretty common kind of method that people will use. It's basically just talking about studying something before learning it in what I call a main learning event, which is basically like a lecture or maybe an intensive study session. It's the time where you're thinking, this is the first time I'm seriously going to sit down to properly study it. That would be the main learning event. And a pre-study is just any type of study that you do before that. And I would say that the way that most people do it can be of mixed effectiveness, and I'm gonna give that a B. Pretty decent, but this is definitely one that can really get better with a few modifications, which we'll talk about in the second part. Next one is practice papers. Practice papers can be kind of a hit and miss. A lot of people love practice papers for good reason, and they can be really effective. I would say that it's harder to do this wrong, and so the common way that people use practice papers is not too bad, and it's genuinely a pretty good way of practicing your retrieval and finding knowledge gaps, as well as being able to test your knowledge at different levels of learning. So I'm gonna give this an A. Next on the list is brain dumps. Now, if you've watched my video on reacting to TikTok advice, you know that blurting, which is essentially a brain dump equivalent, is a very commonly recommended method of studying, which I think has kind of limited benefits, especially in the way that people say to do it. Brain dumps can be, again, an effective way of full uncued, or otherwise called free recall, which is basically whenever you take anything from your memory and you just, well, I guess, yeah, like dump it out. And that can be really helpful. I've definitely used this a lot in the past, and I recommend a lot of my students to use brain dumps. But the thing with brain dumps is that they are very time consuming inherently, and there's not really any way to get past that. And it's not a problem if that time returns for you a really high level of learning, but the way that a lot of people do brain dumps, it doesn't tend to hit that level of quality. So I'm gonna probably give this a C. I think for the amount of time that you spend, there are a lot of other things that you can do that will probably be better. Okay, another one, Pomodoro technique. I've got a video on why the Pomodoro technique is not that great, and this is also the reason why a lot of people don't use the Pomodoro technique long term. Having said that, it is a really easy, great starter technique. There's no learning curve, and if you use it, it's pretty effective straight away. There are things that you can do to make it even better, but that doesn't stop it from being pretty good to begin with. And I think if this is something that you really struggle with, which is like focus and concentration, I actually think that this is a very solid starting point. I'm actually gonna give it an A. Flashcards. You know, a lot of you will know about my channel because how I love to hate on flashcards, but I don't hate flashcards. Flashcards can be an incredibly important and effective tool when you're learning, when you're using it the right way. It's just that if you don't use it the right way, it can be very easy to get overwhelmed. You can drown in your flashcards. And again, flashcards are not great at testing you in more complex types of learning and types of knowledge. So there are certain situations where flashcards are very good. But most people don't know what those situations are. They don't know what conditions flashcards perform well in and which situations it would make you worse in. I think based on just my experience with seeing how people tend to use it, I'm actually gonna give this a straight up D. Which I know, like, just chill out. calm down, let me finish.
But I don't hate flashcards.
Let me explain. Flashcards can be really effective. I'm gonna go through how you can make it more effective later in the second part, but 100% the way that most people use it, it does make their whole experience of learning much harder than it needs to be. And so because it's actually doing more harm than good in a lot of situations compared to what they could be doing, right? Not compared to not studying at all. Like, it's gonna be good if you're not studying at all, but compared to what you could be doing in the same amount of time with the same amount of effort, yeah, I gotta give it a D. All right, the next one is spaced repetition, which is really one of the driving principles behind flashcards. The difference, I think a lot of people will say spaced repetition and flashcards are the same thing, but they're not, because spaced repetition can be in any form, whereas flashcards are a very specific format of doing spaced repetition. The idea of spaced retrieval and spaced retrieval practice is very advantageous. And if you're doing some kind of spaced retrieval practice, that's good. Now, if that retrieval practice is not done very well, it's not going to be as effective as it could be. But as a fundamental principle, you should be spacing retrieval sessions, and therefore very, very solid advice. I think as a general principle, I'm gonna give it an S. I think the reason that most people won't get the full benefit from it is not because they don't understand spaced repetition, but it's because the rate that they're forgetting information is so fast that you have to basically be repeating things like every couple days. Otherwise, you're forgetting so much so quickly that the next time you do it, you're just like overwhelmed. But that's not because the spaced repetition was a problem. It's because of the method we use during the session, which is like a whole other, topic. Next one is the Feynman Technique, or it's otherwise just called like self-teaching or like self-explanation. Feynman Technique is a very, very good method because it's easy to learn. It's creating a lot of free recall opportunities. It's also creating retrieval opportunities at multiple different levels of learning. It requires you to synthesize and simplify and evaluate the quality of your learning. So it's good for gap finding, and it's generally more time efficient in that you're gonna find more gaps that are more high yield, that are at different levels than you would with brain dumps or blurting. So I'm gonna give Feynman Technique probably in the A category. If people are using the Feynman Technique, generally speaking, their learning system tends to be reasonably decent. Next one is active recall. Again, one of the things that I regret actually about one of the earlier videos that has now received over 1 million views, by the way, thank you, is that I really I hated on flashcards because of the spaced repetition, active recall, the problem with the pair. But really, it's not the issue with active recall. Active recall in itself is not problematic. Active recall just is anything that you do that causes you to recall information from your memory, usually without cueing. And that's good. Like, you should really always try to do active recall if you can. And there are lots of ways you can do this. Like, you can do micro active recall, like during a single study session. You can be reading something, covering it, and then immediately just trying to synthesize and generate from memory without constantly referring to the resources. That would be like active recall, where the spacing interval is only like seconds even. And then of course there's like the more common ways of doing active recall, which is like a day or a couple days or a week or a month later. Active recall as a principle in itself, just like spaced repetition, is incredibly effective. And the way that most people use active recall is mostly limited by the fact that they don't know which techniques are the most effective to use for it. But as long as you're recalling something from memory, it tends to be pretty good. I'm actually gonna give this an A, and it can really easily be bumped up to an S, and I'll explain why later. Okay, sleep, look, straight away, sleep's gonna be S, right? The S stands for sleep. It's sleep tier. And the reason is because sleep is one of the most important things for learning. Sleep triggers something called sleep-dependent memory consolidation, which is basically short-term memory that is in an inaccessible part of your brain being shunted over and then properly encoded into your long-term memory. So if you do an all-nighter the night before an exam, you're not likely to be able to perform well in that exam. Number one, because you're gonna be sleep deprived, which I think there are some studies, and I'm not 100% sure about this, but I think there are some studies that have shown that when you're sleep deprived, your IQ points drop by like 10 or 20 points or something like that. If you know the actual statistic on this, leave a comment, let me know. But the effect that lack of sleep has on your cognitive performance is insane. Like, you're literally getting dumber, and that's not what you want when you're sitting an exam. But apart from that, also, because you didn't consolidate your memory, it means that the stuff that you studied over the last like few weeks of cramming, they haven't been properly stored in a way that you can actually use that information. And so, like, you just start crashing on all fronts. I think once you start sacrificing sleep, you are sacrificing like everything. It's a last resort. You should never really sacrifice sleep. So definitely S tier, super underrated as well. Summary pages. The idea behind summary pages is that you basically just take like a longer set of notes and then you summarize them down into like really about as concise as you can get it. Again, summary pages is one of those techniques that is generally pretty effective, and you can't really do it that wrong. There are many things that you can do that would be more effective, and there are many ways that you can make summary pages more effective. The way that I normally see people using summary pages is like literally just condensing what they already have and like just like making it more concise, but it's in the same format and often in the same order, which creates a lot of restrictions. I will say that summary pages, I'm gonna put this either B or C. I'm gonna put it at C. I'm gonna put it at C. I think it's about as effective as doing brain dumps. And actually, a lot of the time, people are just creating summary pages as part of like a blurting or brain dump activity. So it can be effective. And again, that's another one that could really shoot up if you were to do it better. And some of you are probably doing them a little bit better anyway. The next thing, watching videos and lectures. So again, you know, it's pretty broad, but it's like not just watching something, but like watching something and like rewatching it, or like rewatching like a lecture recording. Just the idea of like consuming and taking in that information. Honestly, even though obviously like you need to get the information to do anything with it, so it's like a prerequisite of learning. And as a technique, it's really very low yield, and the way that I see people use like lectures and videos and learning from any like auditory source, I just don't think a lot of people have good training around how to really make that work. So I actually think that that's probably a D. Like, there are a lot of people that will be better off watching and rewatching less, and they would probably do better from it. Next up is mnemonics. Mnemonics really just mean any type of memory aid, technically speaking, but the way that most people use mnemonics is like an acronym or some kind of saying. So for example, like when I was studying medicine, one of the mnemonics, well, there's lots of different mnemonics that we use, but like one of the mnemonics would be like the surgical sieve, which is like vitamin C, D, and E. And it's like a checklist of different things to ask a patient questions about, like, is the problem, man, I haven't thought about this in like years, so let's see if I can still remember it. Like, is the problem vascular, ischemic, T, traumatic, maybe? A for... And this is why I'm not a doctor anymore. Look, it's been 4 years since I've had to think about this. But I remember when I knew it, it was kind of helpful, and there are different mnemonics that can be helpful. I think the way that people tend to use mnemonics is not really great. I'm gonna give it a B. And it can be really powerful. Again, I'll talk about how we can upgrade that. It's pretty simple. Next one, listening to music. Okay, listening to music like really depends on the type of music you listen to, but also depending on the type of thinking you're doing while you're listening to that music. And I've read through, I'd say, a fair amount of research on the effect of listening to music, and it's still pretty like kind of ambiguous. You might be surprised to realize that generally speaking, it doesn't seem to have any real beneficial impact. Like, more often than not, listening to music of any kind tends to produce worse performance. And there are some individuals that are exceptions, but when you look at studies across like a wide group of people, it doesn't tend to consistently make people better. In fact, again, it makes people worse more often. So I'm probably gonna give this actually a D because I think a lot of people really love listening to music when they study because they think it's helping them, but actually it's probably not. And I'll explain the reason why you probably think it's helping even when it's not in a moment. Okay, the next one is Cornell Note-Taking. If you're not familiar with Cornell Note-Taking, it's basically just like a templated sheet of how to take notes where it involves like writing your notes on one side, writing some keywords on the other, and then creating like a summary at the bottom. It's almost like a combination of like creating summary pages and to a certain level, like a Feynman Technique-esque feel to it on a single piece of paper. I give Cornell Note-Taking like a thumbs up for the fact that it was a very early popular method of note-taking that got people to start thinking about how they can write notes in a more strategic way. There's really no way that you can do Cornell Note-Taking wrong because it's just very easy to do. But like many techniques that are just straight up easy to do, it's like there's limited benefits. It's probably at the same level as I'd say a summary page. Actually, I'm gonna give it a B tier. I'm gonna give it higher than summary pages. And the reason is because when you use Cornell Note-Taking, it makes you think about being more concise during the learning event itself. Like it's not, I'm just gonna write all this stuff down and then come back to it like 3 days later and then try to create a summary page out of it. You're forced to summarize and synthesize and condense immediately. And that makes a big difference to your processing power. So for that reason, I'm gonna give it higher than summary pages. Okay, mind maps. You probably know if you're watching this video and you got caught by the algorithm for the first time, in which case, welcome. You probably know that mind maps are like, I'm a big proponent of doing mind maps, but I also have talked about multiple times how the way most people use mind maps is really ineffective. Like it's barely any better and sometimes just worse than writing straight up linear notes. So I will painfully probably actually give mind maps a C. Like it really is not helping most people that are mind mapping, and it's actually completely because the point of how to do mind maps in the right way is missed, because it's not just about doing it. Like you can create as many mind maps as you want, but if the way that you're creating them is not in a certain way, then you will find that it is very, very ineffective and just time consuming and messy and like honestly completely pointless. Like it would be 100% better just to create like a set of Notion notes or like a Zettelkasten type thing instead of doing mind maps in an incorrect technique. The power only comes through where it becomes way better than all those other techniques when you learn to do it the right way. And the final one, a lucky last, rereading and highlighting. I mean, this just plainly sucks. Like, it's just terrible. I don't know what else to say about this. Like, there's so little benefit from doing this, and it's so hard to make it work in a way that's not worse for you. So that's a D. If there was an E, it would be an E. So that's the tier list, part 1. All right, so that was part 1 based on the way that people normally use these techniques. And in part 2, I'm gonna go through how we can modify it and upgrade them so that we can make them even better. If you like this format, let me know in the comments. And if there's any techniques that you want me to go over, then also let me know as well. But otherwise, thank you for watching and I'll see you in part 2.